I
And
stopped. I forgot to start the recording. So now,
now you're recording
now I
this?
am recording it.
Oh dear. Anyway, got I actually quit Amoco at the encouragement of them that I better quit, and then worked for a contractor um, in Amoco or in Oklahoma City. Decided I really liked carpentry. Ended up going back to Wyoming, got married, went to Minnesota, worked as a contract carpenter there, and came across some people at the Underground Research Center in Minneapolis who were architects in out of Oregon, and I was really intrigued with underground homes, highly energy efficient, earth sheltered housing. Um, that got me interested in becoming an architect, and I applied for 3 consecutive years to the University of Oregon because they kept rejecting me. They even rejected me the third time. And on the third time around, I called them back and said, "You guys made a mistake. I really do belong there." And they said, "Oh, you're right. We looked at your application and we think we've made an error." And they put me on the alternate list, and ended up getting into the University of Oregon School of Architecture based on that. And that was what brought me to Eugene and to a master's degree in architecture. Because I was going to be a designer. I wanted to be an architectural designer. But getting out of architecture school, I discovered that there's like one designer and 20 to 30 technical guys supporting that person. And I'm not that person. I'm that technical person. And about 3 years into my architecture career, I decided I really don't want to be that technical person. Um, and I really like working on special buildings. And what happens is you only get to work on the buildings that the firm you're employed with gets the contract to do, and then only if you're available in that firm. So you have to be in a really big firm if you want to work on really cool buildings, because very few small firms get the chance to design them. When I went to work so I quit as an intern in the architecture and went to work for KPFF Structural Engineers because the guy there recruited me because they had this fledgling building enclosure group, and it was headed by a person in Taiwan who was a good engineer designing building cladding systems in Asia. And this was remarkable to me, but he cannot see three-dimensionally. I didn't know that was even possible, but he's a real good two-dimensional individual, but he could not visualize the third dimension. And so my job was to create drawings for him that would give him that other dimension. And so I was constantly sketching stuff behind the 2D view he was looking at. Um, and so I went to work for him. That was my job. And he lasted a year, and then he moved back to Taipei. And they asked me if I wanted to head up that department. Um, so that's how I ended up in building enclosures. With Jimmy, I ended up with contacts in Hong Kong. And for the next 5 years, I went to Asia every 2 or 3 months and learned the building enclosure profession in Shanghai, basically, Shanghai and Hong Kong, doing high-rise buildings for contractors in China. Um, I then tried to apply that, this is the early 90s, that information back to Portland or to the United States, and none of the architects we were working with knew anything about building science or building enclosures. Um, the only job I could get was designing a high-rise curtain wall. Um, they weren't interested in waterproofing, and at that time there weren't air barriers. They were just new technology. Um, so I slowly built that up in Portland, and then there was several firms in Vancouver, Washington that were more dedicated to air barriers and more building science. And they started moving south. They opened offices in Seattle, and then they opened offices in Portland, and then that's who I was now competing with. And so I had to kind of learn what they knew. And in 2000, in an agreement with KPFF, I took that company private. It went outside of KPFF to a basically I owned this company called the Facade Group, and that name comes from inside of KPFF. Each of the partners has their group. So there was Bill's group, Joe's group, and then mine, because I was not a partner, was the Facade Group. And that's where the name, the Facade Group, came from. When I left KPFF, it kept it as the Facade Group. So there's the 15 years of construction experience. And then the architectural experience starts in 70 or 83. To answer your question. In not a short means.
Well, so that's quite a lot of buildings you've seen over that many years. It's 40 years, right? Give or take.
Well, yeah, in practice from 90, probably 30 years of real practice. Well, 25 years of real practice. So I retired out of this business in 2018, when RWDI, who I assume you know, chose to purchase the company.
So you mentioned some of them are in Asia, and then I guess quite a lot of would be in your neighborhood in Oregon, Washington.
Yeah, the thing about Portland is at that period of time, they would build a high-rise every 3 to 5 years, maybe one building. So the nice part about downtown Portland is that the big commercial buildings were constructed once every 5 or 6 years, so that you don't have a lot of building going on. So a lot of my work ended up being in California. So KPFF had offices all up and down the West Coast. So I worked in Seattle, worked in LA, wherever KPFF had offices at the time. So that's how you ultimately end up getting to know me sometime in the early 2000s.
2006 in spring.
I'm not sure what timing was of when you and I met. Yeah. So
I still have that initial.
So the name Facade Group somehow attracted you from the East Coast.
Well, it was an ad that your company posted. I responded to it in April 2006, and you immediately interviewed me over the phone in a couple of days, and then I believe 1 or 2 weeks later I was already there knocking to your door. Checking, and what impressed me was you were. I mean, your company was one of the few that actually engaged in the design, in terms that it took responsibility for the details. Something that the average building enclosure consultant in the United States was very risk averse. Right, it was all about managing potential liability. Very few companies, typically coming from either Asia or Europe or Australia, were knowledgeable enough to take on the what is called now the design assistance, and that was quite unusual.
So that then goes to my background of engineering and architecture, wanting to be a designer, and realizing that really I'm a technical person. I'm a really good technical designer. It also, we wanted to grow, but it was really difficult finding somebody who wanted to work in this profession. And I think what you discovered also is that a lot of the building enclosure people have a pat way of doing something. Like they've learned, you always take the tape and put it on in this manner. And I believe you learn the technical side of that tape or the technical side of what that product does, and then learn to apply it to the situation you have at hand. Because there is not a one size fits all or a one answer to all questions. You really need to adapt the product or the technology to fit the science of what it is you're trying to do. And that's what I really enjoyed, was that challenge of how to get the architect the vision that he wanted or she wanted, and still make the building perform the way I thought it ought to perform in the real world. And as you go through my 15 years of personal career, or 25 years of actually working with KPFF and that, you find that more and more people form buildings enclosure companies, and you start competing with the person who's not really trying to design but has the one size fits all, or I know I've done that kind of thing before, I'll do it again. And they're a lot less expensive than the person who's actually going to take the effort to figure out how to make the architect's design function. And so it ultimately becomes an economic issue of what you're competing with.
Well, I'm really glad that we have that Riverside connection, because unfortunately the connection breaks every couple of seconds, so I will probably only hear what you just said in a review of the tape. Every couple of seconds I lose you.
So the internet connection is not fluid, huh? Yeah, well, you're real blurry on my
screen. Blurry part is not something that I...
probably both my internet.
You are blurry too, iffy. But what I'm worried about is the loss of audio. That's the most important part. You know, you can watch a movie as long as you have good audio. Right? It's kind of a prerequisite. And here, hopefully we do. So let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
You know,
we'll find out later, huh?
Under your belt, so to speak. Would you say that if someone who you really care about decides to invest or buy a house or buy a unit in one of those buildings, would you say, hey, don't do it? Are there buildings that may someone may prefer?
I have
already
done
that.
I have advised a person. Yes, I have advised a person to stay out of that building.
You used your insider's knowledge, we say,
they were
stock market.
So you ultimately end up in high-rise. Yeah, you end up in high-rise condos. I mean, as you move through this, it starts with office buildings, but by say 2010, it's high-rise condominium. People are building condos, and that was the building type that developers were willing to hire our company for because of the liability down the road of having a failure. And so I advised people I knew, acquaintances, friends, who were looking to move into these condos, stay away from this one, that one's probably okay. And that's it. A lot of what I learned out of this, it's towards the end of my career, is I really wanted to work for what I called the build-to-own developer versus the build-to-sell developer. So the developer who was building a building to sell it was interested in maximizing return. So how little do I spend and how much do I get once I sell it? The build-to-own developer didn't want any issues with that building because he would have to repair them. So if he was building it to own it, he was way more interested in how do I minimize my risk. And they became the more enjoyable people to work for. And I found that through my whole career, is that if money is your primary means by which you make decisions, then ultimately humanity gets hurt because of it. Because eventually you come down to decision matrix of money versus people. And so I've, throughout my career, probably about the 80s, when I realized that you got to decide, are your decision making monetary based, or is there other things that are going to influence that decision making? The reason I left Amoco was purely that. It takes a little bit, but I can give you the story if you're interested. So the only reason I lasted with Amoco for only 4 months is 3 months in, they took all of us newbies to, I was in Oklahoma, back to Denver to what was supposed to be a corporate board meeting. At that meeting, the board people were arguing whether or how to deal with this lease. They had a lease, they had drilled a well, and it wasn't pumping enough oil to pay all of the expenses of owning the lease. And this small mom and pop shop owned the controlling rights to that, and so they had to pay the operating costs. That company had asked Amoco if they could swap interest in an adjoining well. They owned similar interest in all of them. If they swapped the interest, the mom and pop shop would then have more percentage of the one they'd already drilled, and they'd be able to be profitable. The other well they had not yet drilled, and Amoco's engineers predicted that one would be a bigger producer. So swapping interests would have been in Amoco's best interest. They would have actually made more money based on their predictions than they would have by keeping the two interests separate. However, if they did not swap interests, they would bankrupt this guy because he couldn't afford to pay the interest. Then they could buy his interest at a lower rate, and they would have both. They'd have the interest in both wells, but they would make more money and he'd be gone. And that was the decision they made at the board meeting, and I wrote a scathing review of that. And out of my review of that, I was told I didn't have what it took to be the mold of an Amoco employee, and it'd be best for me if I left. And I did. I quit. And when I quit, I didn't get unemployment because they didn't fire me. I got the raw end of that. I learned on that one also. Had I let them fire me, I would have been able to collect unemployment. But because I quit, I didn't get to. So it was an experience where money was the dominant decision making. And I don't know whether that was a real board meeting or if that was a setup just to see how we would behave with that type of mentality. But that's not me. It's like,
I hear you.
So that same mentality proceeds into the rest of, actually to everything you do. There are people whose decision matrix is all about the money. And you do that, ultimately somebody gets hurt economically or emotionally because of that decision. I mean, look at the environment. We have climate change issues because businesses have made decisions that it's more, their bottom line economics are more important than taking environmental measures to not pollute.
I hear you.
I don't know how much of that you're hearing,
well,
Karol.
Every now and then there is a gap.
Okay. Well, hopefully the recording works.
Well,
You'll find
it
out.
says it's recording, so
and if
let's
not,
be of good thought.
Maybe there's something else.
Well, in preparation, this was supposed to be kind of a preparatory meeting, so you and I can think about questions and answers that and we just run through some stuff that would obviously be easy starters, like tell me about yourself, what brought you to this trade. Obviously, it's interesting to see the basics of it. What makes a building a good building versus a bad building, where you would dissuade your friends and family to buy units or invest in a way, shape, or form. Then just kind of a big picture of what what is it over those 30 years, you said, right, give or take, in your practice that makes you proud versus what if you were given another lease, what would you do differently? Like you said, you would let yourself get fired from Amico. Or was it not consistent with your philosophy at the time? You would quit anyway.
Mm-hmm. So, was that a question
Well,
or I missed it?
yes,
Something broke up
you
in
were
that
wondering
process.
whether it was a setup or whether it was the actual meeting, and you quit because you didn't feel like the philosophy or overarching MO of this company was aligned with yours, right? While you did it, you realized that you would be much better off if you stayed and let yourself get fired. So if you went back in your shoes at the time, would you do it differently? Would you let yourself get fired as opposed to quit?
No, because I was ignorant. If I go back in time to the same mindset, um, I didn't know any better. So if you go forward and say, yeah, I know I would have let them fire me, yeah, because then I would have got unemployment. I wouldn't have been looking for work. Um, so yeah, I would have made a monetary decision that forced them to fire me because the guy told me he was going to. He basically called me Jim Dolph. I remember that guy's name. He called me in his office and he says, "Here's the scenario. You're not you don't have the mold of an Amoco employee. So either you quit and or we're going to fire you. And I would suggest you quit because it's better for your record."
I
So
hear
I
you.
did. And I would do the same thing again based on the knowledge I had at that time, moving.
So would you describe
Yeah,
yourself as an idealist at heart?
optimist. I'd use the word optimist versus idealist, but yes, yeah, and problem solving. I like the challenge of solving a problem. Um, so to kind of turn this around, tell me a history of how you got from Poland to Florida.
Well,
I'm curious how you end up in building enclosures, building
well, I
science
was
too.
already in this line of field while I was in Poland. Um, there was that Russian crisis that kind of threw the economy upside down. I believe that was around 2001, 2002, around that time. So at the same time, my wife got her PhD and got her first job offer, which was in France. And she and I were always, you know, dreaming about moving to France and living there and learning language, getting into this culture. So this was a tough decision, and this decision that I ultimately made to go instead to United States. And we are too poor to really to go to France. If we went to France, she would remain as a postdoc at some university. If I had a crystal ball to tell what it would look like, and I would probably be managing some floors at whatever local supermarket store, or perhaps driving a pickup truck back and forth, delivering groceries or whatever. That's ultimately a choice between developing your skills or living in a pleasant environment where people are, people's culture more aligned with yours. That's what I think right now, particularly here in South Florida. It's it's a very nice climate. The economy is good. It's just people that really are completely different. So we moved to New York City, where she got a postdoc at the Columbia University. And I had this very nice kind of a visa, which is, I don't remember, J2, something like that, that allowed me to switch to employees. I wasn't hostage to any single employee. So in that initial period when I still learned the language, when I learned the intricacies of the construction and the building codes and everything around it, it allowed me to move relatively quickly. First I started with, it was pretty incredible because that's the part that I wanted to include in the movie. I went to that Polish ethnic neighborhood, which I believe now is completely gone. It was priced out of Queens, was called Greenpoint. And they have that all small shady employment agencies around there. So you went there and you actually were supposed to pay to get the job. So I went there and I say, hey, can you get me a job in an architectural office? And they're like, what? We never heard about it. You have a choice here. You can go to become a cleaner, you can go and become a daycare, or you become a construction worker. The choice is yours. You pay us the first week of your salary. We don't look into your paperwork. And you have a job.
And you have a
So
job.
my first job was with a Polish SAP who was doing a brick reconstruction work. So they took me up on a scaffold on one of those huge multi-residential buildings in, I believe, someplace in Queens. And they were busily demolishing the portions of the brick facade that's immediately above the lintel, replacing the corroded lintels, replacing or installing, if there was never any flashing, and installing new brickwork, and then repointing the facade, which was pretty typical in brick-dominated construction neighborhoods in New York, in Chicago, Illinois, places like that. So I was assigned as a junior to carry out the debris, while the more experienced worker was doing his hammer work.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
So that kind of pointed me into, and I met the subcontractor several times later, because when I worked ultimately at Israel Burgers, we got acquainted with almost everybody who doing this kind of reconstruction work in a city. So it was interesting because at the same time, at the time I was so poor that I couldn't really afford to buy a New York Times Sunday edition to get those job offers from their section, Sunday section. So I just went to Starbucks. I didn't buy a coffee, but I took the page and I wrote down the telephone numbers and I email addresses if they provided, and I sent the resume. And at that time, around that time, they started calling me back and sending me emails inviting me for an interview. So I believe on the second day on my job there, I asked the super whether I would be allowed to give, to have a break in the middle of the day for 2 hours to go for a job interview. He said, nope. I was able to push it, but it required me to
Of course not.
require me
Mine.
to very quickly change my clothes. I still remember, I was doing it in the middle of the city bus, and there was a young lady sitting on the opposite side, and she was, apparently was in a different set of mind. So she thought, well, she asked me, "Hey, are you going to meet your girlfriend?" Most women don't realize that in Europe, or in Poland, or specifically in Poland, you wear a ring on the right hand as opposed to on the left. So they say, "No, I'm going for a job interview." and I got hired. There was
Oh, really?
a small
Different hand.
architectural office in Yonkers. It's like a small city right next to New York City, a little bit north. I believe it was approximately 1 hour commute every day out of the city because we lived downtown, out of the city to Yonkers. And those
Oh, wow.
interview invites kept coming in. So I kept going to the interviews. Most of them were downtown, some of them were in places like Brooklyn. And I ended up with Israel Berger. Israel Berger immediately decided to hire me. He offered me a much better financial terms. So I believe I stayed with that small architectural firm. I
Sure.
stayed around 2 weeks, and it was tough, right? It's really unpleasant to quit your job in a place which you really like, but obviously the it was pretty much the same consideration. The money they were doing were completely incomparable to what Israel Berger was making. So, assuming that the employee is taking 1/3 of what's on the table, the choice was obvious. I ended up with Israel, and after a couple of years, I got hired by Rafael Vignoli, which was interesting because it was still the same set of ads from a single Sunday section of the New York Times. They just, they were going through old emails, old telephone calls, and finally they went through all the candidates. They ended up with me. And I went there to interview, and suddenly they say, hey, why don't you come and join us? And at the Israel Burgers, the situation was kind of sour at the time. I was probably the number one most hated employee over there because everywhere I went, I saw things. Building talked to me. I was kind of, it took me a while to realize what was really going on because they didn't really talk to me. But I was kind of overqualified for this job, and whenever they sent me somewhere, I put the previous guy in a bad light because I suddenly produced 100-page long report where I listed all the stuff that was missed, and was like, oops, we don't want this guy on any any work that was previously. I was a problem, and
You're a
obviously
problem.
it was also on the client side because having someone like me was a liability. I remember one job on Long Island, where I went and I started seeing things, questioning. I eventually got a structural engineer to come on site to look at some things, and Israel Berger was fired because of me. So it was a testament to their fairness that they sat with me and they say, "Hey, you did nothing wrong. We understand. It was the right thing to do." Right, so they realized there was a particularly bad building. And here is a question to you: what is your distinction? What do you believe is a bad building versus a good building? If you look back in the years.
Well, I'll have to think about that
Let
one.
me let me clarify or perhaps rephrase. Uh-huh.
Bad building is where decisions. Like a bad building is one where decisions are made based on either something historical or somebody who doesn't have the capacity to actually be making that
So you
decision.
look at it from constructive perspective.
And then they move forward. Um, yeah, yeah. I look at a bad building as a way it was pieced together versus aesthetically what it looks like. Is another way to look at it. But it's to me, it's the
Uh-huh.
components and how they're assembled.
And did you, well,
And for you,
yeah, because
that's an interesting question.
ultimately, my scale kind of diluted over the years. Initially, I thought that the reason why I saw those buildings is because they are particularly bad. But as the years passed, I realized that it's probably something wrong with me. I am perhaps too strict. And looking back, I realized that things that I considered to be really bad perhaps were pretty standard, or are still standard at this time. Right? I was taking a wrong measure. I compared everything to Poland, to Germany, Austria, places where things are done at a much higher quality level. And obviously, everything that I would look at here in the United States was substandard in that measure. So then one tries to develop a second metrics. And I believe, what I saw on the United States Coast Guard training, there was a single slide which I found very, very valuable. It had two axes, and one axis was severity, the other one axis was probability, and everything, including the mild, was essentially the diagonal line across the chart, was everything above and including mild was only registering
Mm-hmm.
since then. And obviously, it's difficult to make that determination where I am in the middle of things. Right? I am a little bit too detail oriented, so I keep picking things that may be too detailed, too nitpicky, at the risk of losing a big picture. That's the challenge here. This building back in Long Island, I still, every couple of years I look it up online, seeing if it's still standing, if it hasn't collapsed yet. Later, I spoke with Israel Berger at some point, and he told me that there was a huge lawsuit. Uh, but it was a residential building, so that's what residential buildings do. People keep fighting over them, not necessarily about the things that are really bad about them.
Yep.
They sometimes pick things that are not necessarily registering on any level of scale.
So I think it's very difficult to get the ideal world of what you and I know you can do in the way of details, and to get that sandwich with the reality of what the current world provides. If I look back at what is now standard construction technology, at least in this area, um, it's way above what it was when I started this career in the late 80s. Uh, Air barriers didn't exist. That was not even a product. So manufacturers have developed products that we can now use, and it was I remember a big issue in around 2010 when architects accepted the fact that they were going to put an air barrier on a building. Um, I was told by an architect that they would no longer hire me because I kept demanding that damned air barrier, and it cost money. And it made them, as an architect, non-competitive with another architect who would not demand it. And they weren't going to demand it. Basically, I was costing the owner money and the architect, my client, work because I was demanding it. So, we've gone from a period of time when that was the reality to now I don't know of an architect that designs a building that doesn't have one. So it's a matter, again, is you have an awareness and a skill set and a knowledge level that puts you way beyond the norm or the mainstream. And so how do we take that mainstream and notch it up just a little bit, just change the slope of where we're going, to move them in that direction versus demand? Kind of like, it reminds me of what's going on in Congress right now. We've got the real progressive liberal side that's demanding a whole lot of stuff that the rest of the world is not going to accept. But they might take them a little bit that direction. It's just, we can't get what we know, what we want. So how do we move the scale a little bit in the direction we want to go? It's also interesting, you and I both have a connection to Israel Berger. I'm not sure
Tell
we
me
ever
more
discussed
about
that. He offered to buy the company somewhere
Mm-hmm.
in the mid-teens. He and I don't remember the guy's right-hand guy, the guy who's number one, came out. Israel's a really nice guy. This other guy is a Looney Tune. Anyway, they had 3 or 4 different people that showed up. We met, talked for a while, and at the end of the day, what they were offering was going to pay the taxes I would have to pay on the amount of money that they said the business was worth. I'd come out with nothing at the end of the day and be a part of this group. They had sold the company to an investment banking firm, or yes, I don't know. People who had a lot of money basically bought Israel Berger and this other guy, you know him, I'm sure,
Oh, yes, I
out.
remember.
They were going to make a lot of money. The idea was to grow the company, to buy. They were going to buy the Facade Group, then they would have a presence on the West Coast, which they didn't have, and this investment firm would turn over and sell the whole entity to some other investment firm. But basically, the investment people took all the money out, and all the employees got minimal out of it, except for the few people at the top that originally came in on the plan. But I met Israel. Through Israel, met a person named a Mark
Mark
Weisbach or
Weisberg,
Weisberg,
yes.
that's that guy's name, that worked for him. Um, yeah, there's another guy that's connected to all this named Jordan. Can't remember Jordan's name, but he sells solar cells, and I've hired him to put 2 different solar arrays up for me. His name's Weisberg or something. He's somehow related to Israel. And when I was doing this connection with Israel, Jordan had moved to Portland and got married, and Israel put me and Jordan together. He was a brand new company. Anyway, it's just this connection through Israel goes a long ways. And I have a great deal of respect for Israel. I like him a lot. Mark, I don't.
Well, you are not alone. I believe this was a
So
common feeling. It was like a good cop, bad cop type of relationship. They sat in 2 offices next to each other, and Mark
I
was the guy who was taking care of business, while Israel was more of a visionary.
so my take on the 2 of them is Israel's view and decision making has other components, and Mark's is totally money, 100% money. Like, whichever of these 2 things make more money, that's the one I'm choosing. Was my take on them. It brings us back to a prior
I hear you.
comment I have.
Going back to the
So
decision I made, it was a second kind of decision where, similar rational thought process took over emotional considerations. To go to Florida to work here as opposed to go to Portland, Oregon. I believe that was like a perfect match, in terms of me fitting in, skill wise, and I believe in terms of the personalities. But one cannot really pick and choose when one is hungry.
Well, actually, I think it was the right decision in the long run, so that's
It's
fine. It's like I think you're much happier in Florida than
well,
you were
I
going
don't
to be in
know.
Portland
Frankly,
at the
I
end of the
don't have
day.
a way to to assess whether at that convergence point, if we chose different path, would we be happier? Whenever I look into the first decision, go to Nice in France or go to New York in the United States, I'm also not particularly sure, whether we made the right decision. Right? We got stuck here for over 20 years, and it's taken a toll. And anyway, let me what I wanted also to hear from.
Well, let
Go
me
ahead.
ask you one other quick. Are you happy?
I'm never happy. I am never satisfied. I always want more. That's the challenge.
But are you happy? You can want more, but you can still be happy.
Well,
You smile a lot.
I feel fulfilled, and I think that that's the most important thing at the end of the day when you say, "Hey, uh, did I really spend those hours efficiently?" That's number one question for me, and the answer most of the time is yes.
Hmm.
So in that terms, that I am always striving for efficiency to make sure that every single hour and every single day is used to the best of its abilities, so I don't have to feel any regrets looking back. Yes, it worked for me, but I believe it was Brian Tracy, I think, that described the human career as like a corridor, where until you enter the corridor, you don't know which doors are open, which doors are closed, and once you chose the corridor, you may discover certain doors are open. So it's pretty impossible, I believe, to look at it this way. If I were less picky and didn't get fired, on miscellaneous jobs, would this affect my career? Probably. Right. If I decided to go to the West Coast, would it? Those are questions that I don't believe are possible to answer.
So my wife has a philosophy that when you're presented with choices, you seriously consider both of them, and then you make a decision. But once you make the decision of which one you're doing, you never re-question the other one because it's impossible to follow that path because you're not going to follow it, and you're just wasting brain cells on it. So every decision is the right decision,
Well,
and you move forward with that decision, and you look forward to the next decision because your path is always full of forks. You can go this way, this way, this way. You can always. So you just look forward to the next decision, and based on prior decisions and what you know and what you see of this decision, because you can't predict the future of those two paths, those diverging paths. You just
I
pick
do.
one, and it's the right one, and then you can be happier with the decision because
I do believe this is the rational
yeah.
approach. Is your wife more rational than you?
Wow. She's more creative, which I think creativity is less rational.
It may be the other way around.
I think rationality can get in the way of creativity.
Definitely true.
Yeah, it may be. I don't know, but I do buy into that philosophy. I really think why waste time trying to decide if you made that decision? It would have been a better one because there's way too many decisions you can waste time thinking about.
Let me.
You can learn from the decision, like that you the building in New York that you chose to make an issue of, which seems to have dogged you for a while about that decision, and you've learned a lot from it. But it was the right decision at the time because it has led you to be more of who you are now.
Yes, and seeing that it hasn't collapsed yet, makes me question my own judgment at the time.
Yeah.
I was positive it will collapse within the next couple of years. It hasn't happened yet.
It's good to question
Well, but
oneself, I
it's
think.
yeah,
Questioning yourself is good. Trying to question a
that's
decision is
true.
not.
Well, let me ask you another.
So anyway, you were asking
No,
a
no,
question.
no.
I diverted us again. I'm sorry.
The comparison, right? You are in Oregon, which is more like a humid climate, and previously you worked in Asia in place of like Hong Kong, which is also humid. But those two places, I believe, come with completely different construction cultures, different considerations. How did you? Um, what is your take on? You have a good comparison
Hmm.
between how it's done in Asia versus how it's done on the west board of the United States.
So um, Oregon is humid, but it's not hot and humid, and it's actually quite dry in the summer. It's humid in the winter, and we get a lot of rain. I mean, it's raining right now, but it comes as a light drizzle. So when considering moisture in the form of either liquid, being rain, snow, versus humidity, which is vapor, um, you need to consider also the temperatures and the environment you're in. And so I ended up doing a fair amount of work in Phoenix. Phoenix is considered an incredibly dry climate, and the people there don't believe that water infiltration or rot is a problem. But it's actually more of a problem in Phoenix than it is in Oregon. And the reason is in Oregon, we typically get a constant drizzle with very little wind. And so it's small drops of water falling vertically. In Phoenix, they don't get a lot of water, but when they do, it comes as a monsoon. It comes as a very, very heavy downpour and typically high wind. So what it does is drives that liquid water into the wall, which immediately is followed by 100-degree temperatures. So you now got water inside your wall, you now have a high temperature, and you now have a vapor drive in. So you turn all of that liquid water that just went through the skin into vapor, and the pressure differential is out to in, and so you're pushing that vapor now into the wall where it is now air conditioned, so it's cold, so it now condenses and now rots out the system. So you know, you really need to look at the overall climate. So in Hong Kong, it's hot and humid. They got a lot of humidity. They also get typhoons, hurricanes, which you get to deal with. But their construction technology is typically single wide brick for apartment buildings, buildings people live in. High-rise buildings tend to be unitized curtain wall. So a well-designed unitized curtain wall is pretty bulletproof. You know, it's aluminum and glass and sealant. None of it really rots if you get humidity against it. So what I worked on tended to be high-rise curtain wall. What I learned to do was design a unitized curtain wall. They didn't stick built, they unitized it. Um, so it different construction technologies. Where you get to the United States, we don't do unitized because it's too expensive, but the expense is in the labor, not the material. In Asia, labor is not considered as part of the construction process. So um, I've been on job sites and they literally brought 100 new people in. Um, they didn't care about the labor cost. They cared about the material cost. So what is the material going to cost? So if you can do a unitized curtain wall and it's very labor intensive to put together, but now you don't have to worry about the people on site, that's what you do. Or if they poured a concrete floor and it ended up being a foot out of square, they went up there with not jackhammers, hammers and chiseled out that corner and brought it back in the way it needed to be. So you can't compare the two. It's just like I've seen them do stone columns where they put the stone up and then they sit there for days and hand polish it to where the round column has a joint that's like a millimeter wide joint, and the two pieces of stone are absolutely in plane with each other. In the United States, they would not let me do two stones that didn't have a half-inch joint. They needed that sealant to take care of the offset in the stone. So, you know, it's not necessarily one has better weathering, but one definitely has better aesthetics. And again, it's a labor-intensive process. Which is why the United States imports so much material from China. Is labor is really not a big factor in materials or assembly of product. It wasn't. It may be getting there now, but 20 years ago it wasn't.
Well,
It's your turn. We're approaching an hour. You've got an
I
hour
know,
worth of
I
video
know.
to
So
re-listen to,
let me
Karol.
guess. We have a very good idea at this point. At least I have, of what would be, usable. So we can also think about questions and answers for the next time, because I hope I will be able to get you to, thank you. I see you, nodding your head.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, my nose is killing me. And I will check if the recording came through. Let you know how did it go, whether we need to improve anything next time. We'll think about questions and answers back and forth. At some point, I would send you a short page, which is a release form. So when you look at the video and you are happy with that, you would release me from, promise not to sue me.
I
Well,
can't
at
sue
least
you,
not
Karol.
over that particular section of the video.
Okay. Okay.
So,
That's fine. Maybe I'll sue you for going to
welcome.
Florida.
My hope is that over this year we would be able to get some events such as a summer camp, and it would make my job a little bit easier. Right. So if you would also be coming to the summer camp, let me know. That would be definitely something that I would fly to United States.
I haven't been to summer
participate.
camp in.
But it's ultimately Joe's decision. I would totally understand if he decides that there would be no more summer camps in the future. I hope not. Well,
Does he have summer camp anymore? I haven't been to summer camp in 20 years.
I haven't been to summer camp, I don't know how many years, probably over 10 years. But for the last 2 years, they canceled, obviously, because of the epidemics.
Yeah.
Sensibly enough. But at this stage, people are slowly retiring from the trade. And I don't know, some people, even though they may be pushing the retirement age, they are still willing to make a trip to the summer camp. So I guess this year or the next year would be really the most important ones, the one after the 2 year break. Or if I go to the West Coast, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't. Joe has to be. Joe has to be my age. He's got to be pushing 70, 75.
I don't know
I
either,
don't
but
know.
he's
I turned 70
he's
in
fully
2 weeks.
justified to give it up at this stage. I heard. I sat with Fiona, it's Fiona Aldous, the other day, and she told me that
Yeah.
Joe Stibrook's daughter decided to part ways, and she now runs her own some sort of online what it's called, not the Facebook, but there is one of those social media things is that she runs kind of a daily, it's called Building Enclosure Fight, I believe, some fight club. Pinterest, I believe this is called Pinterest.
Interesting.
Wow. So she.
Yeah, I don't do any of them, so
I signed
doesn't
up
matter.
specifically to see what she's doing. So it looks like she's following her father's steps, but in her own separate way. So I don't know what's his rationale. He didn't respond to my email when I requested him and John to have an interview with them. We'll see.
So do you know if Joe is
I
still
don't
working?
know. I don't know.
Is Joe still working? What's Fiona up to? She didn't respond to my email
she's
either,
quite
so.
busy, and she's like a road warrior these days. I was supposed to meet her in Sarasota, Florida, which is on the west coast of the Florida Peninsula, not the west coast of the United States. And I understood that she's kind of remotely working there in some sort of an office. But it turns out that she is based yet somewhere else north. But the company sends her to small places like Lakeland, Florida, in the middle of nowhere, where she attends to small jobs. Relatively small, and she just travels. She's running plenty of miles. So I met her eventually in West Palm Beach, of all the places, where she was attending some testing. So I kind of feel sorry for her. It was one of the reasons why I acquired the plane and a pilot license to be able to fly Florida like that. But doing it with a car, driving back and forth so many hours, that doesn't seem like a good way to spend the rest of your life. They have a small office here in Palm Beach.
No.
I met her co-worker there, also a girl. So it seems that they kept her busy. I was particularly interested about that University of Wisconsin thing. It sounds that it's going strong.
Yeah.
They have several people running it, and there's quite a lot of enthusiasm, and they have a number of people willing to participate. So this is good to hear. So it's. Yes, she
And she
is
participates
one of
too,
the
or?
lecturers. I believe the name she gave me, I believe it was Chris Schumacher, who is also providing those. So it's interesting to hear that she didn't want to talk to the camera. She didn't want to do anything official. And obviously, the people who work for large companies like that, they don't have much latitude, I would say, to you and I are pretty much at greater freedom than anybody else that I know. to to badmouth certain aspects of our professional life, or the whole sectors of it.
Yeah, if you're still working,
Yeah,
you want to
well,
be
at this
careful.
point, I don't have to anymore. It's part of the that's part of the reason why I'm doing that project, right? Because it's a wash at this stage. Rob, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, I'll think of questions too.
Let's
You
do
can think of
that.
questions.
Let's do that.
Yeah,
Nice to
enjoyed it,
see
Karol.
you.
Nice to see you again.
And I haven't met your wife, but pass my regards to her.
I shall.
Wonderful. Take care.
Sounds good.